In topic 4, we are going to be learning how to FOIL and factor polynomials. So let's begin with foiling polynomials. Now, FOIL is an acronym. It stands for first, outside, inside, last. And what it helps us do is it helps us multiply a binomial by a binomial. So remember, a binomial has two terms. So if you look at this example here, both of these have two terms. So they're both binomials. So we start with the first term in each bracket and we multiply those first. So we do x times x because those are the ones that appear first in these two binomials. Then we look at the two terms on the outside of each set of brackets. So the outside ones would be the x here and the 1 over here, and we multiply those two. Then we look at the inside terms, which would be the 9 and the x, and we multiply those two together. And finally, we look at the last terms. That would be the 9 and the 1, and we would multiply those two. So let's just hop into an example, and you'll see right away how this works. So example 1, expand and simplify. So let's follow FOIL here. So our first step is going to be the first terms, f, in FOIL. So I'm going to put number 1 here, and we're going to multiply those two together. So we're going to multiply x times x, which is equal to x squared. Now let's move on to the outside, the O in FOIL. So the outside terms are x times 2, which is equal to 2x. Now we'll continue with the inside terms, or the I in FOIL, which would be negative 4 times x, which would equal negative 4x. And finally, we're going to multiply the last terms, or in other words, negative 4 times 2. And that is equal to negative 8. So now we just multiplied both of these binomials, and this is going to be our final answer here. So let's actually write this as a polynomial. So in other words, we can say that x minus 4 times x plus 2 is equal to x squared, that's this one over here, plus 2x minus 4x minus 8. And make sure you simplify this by combining like terms. So you'll notice that these two right here are like terms. So let's combine those together. So we would have x squared, and then we have 2x minus 4x. Well, that leaves us with minus 2x and then minus 8. This is the answer to multiplying those two binomials together. And we did so using the FOIL method. So let's look at another one here. So let's start off with the f in FOIL. That would be the first terms in each. So 8 times 3, that gives us 24. So that's our f in FOIL. Then we're going to do the O, which is the outside terms, which is 8 times negative b. So that would leave us with negative 8b. Then let's do the inside, negative b times 3, which is negative 3b. And finally, the last terms, negative b times negative b, which would leave us with plus b squared. Because remember, a negative times a negative is equal to a positive. And b times b gives us b squared. So now we FOILed it, but we have to still simplify by combining like terms. So like always, when you FOIL, the two like terms end up being these two middle ones here. So we are going to have 24. Now we have negative 8b minus another 3b, so that's going to leave us with negative 11b, and then plus b squared. And a rule in math is to always write polynomials in descending order, meaning starting with the biggest exponent and working our way down. So we're actually going to reorder this here for our final answer. The biggest exponent would be this term over here, so we're going to put that one first. Then the next biggest exponent is technically the invisible 1 on this middle term here. So we're going to do b squared minus 11b, and then finally plus 24. That constant always comes at the end. So this would be our final answer here. And just put a little side note for yourself that this is in descending order. So that there is foiling. It's super easy and I think it's fun. Now let's move on to factoring. Now this skill here is the most important one of all. We need to master how to do this. And by the end of this unit, I hope all of you have this mastered. And I'm going to try my best so that each and every one of you know how to do this because it is so important. Now, every teacher teaches this differently. Well, I won't say every teacher, but there are a bunch of different ways to teach factoring. If you were to Google a video on this, you probably won't find the method that I'm using unless you use these keywords. The method we are going to be using is crisscross factoring. And in my opinion, this one is the fastest because this is going to become the 1+1 of Precal. You need to be able to do this in a second. Now, that being said, if you find this method too difficult, feel free to go look at another method on YouTube, and that one might stick with you more. I'm okay with that. As long as you factor it correctly, I don't care which method you use, but this is the one that I'm going to be teaching you. So let's start with this example 2. Now, when we factor these trinomials here, we're actually going to be going in reverse to what we just did when we were foiling. So we're starting off with this bottom step here, and we need to get to this step here. So to begin, what we're going to do is we need to start by looking at factors of the first term here and the last term over here. So what I mean by that is we're going to be looking at factors of x squared and factors of 8. So the only way we could factor x squared, aka turn it into two things that multiply to equal x squared, is x times x. That is the only possible way for us to split it up into two terms that multiply to equal x squared. Now let's do the same thing with the 8. Now we have a couple options for the 8. We could do 1 times 8, which is 8, or we could do 2 times 4. I'm going to do 2 times 4 for this example here. So we have x times x is equal to x squared, and we have 2 times 4 is equal to 8. Now we're going to do the crisscrossing. So I'm going to put a little arrow here and a little arrow here. Now when we crisscross, we are going to multiply along the crisscross. So what I mean by that is we are going to start here and we're going to do x times 2. What does that give us? That gives us 2x. I'm just going to erase this little arrow here. And now let's do the same thing along the other cross. We're going to go down here. We're going to do x times 4. So we get 4x. Now with these two terms we have in red over here, we need to decide to either add or subtract them in order for us to get this middle term here. Okay, so is there any way that we could get negative 2x from 2x and 4x? Yes, there is. We could do plus 2x minus 4x, because that would give us minus 2x, which is our middle term, and that's what we're looking for here. So you see these signs that we decided to put over here? We're going to now plop them one up here, so the plus goes up there and the minus goes down here. And we have one final step to do. These are actually our two binomials that multiply to our trinomial up here. So our final answer is x squared minus 2x minus 8 is equal to, then up here we have x plus 2, and down here we have x minus 4. And that is your final answer. We fully factored that trinomial. Now, I understand that this is a lot of steps and that was probably a little bit confusing, but I promise the more you do it, it'll become second nature for you. And like I said in class, the beautiful thing about factoring is you can check your answers. So we're going to do that. So we're going to check by foiling. So let's take our factored polynomial there. So we have x plus 2 and x minus 4. And let's FOIL this. So the first terms would be x times x, which is equal to x squared. Then we have the outside terms, x times negative 4, which would be negative 4x. Then we have the inside, which is 2 times x, which is plus 2x. And finally, 2 times negative 4, which would be negative 8. And now let's simplify this and see if we get our original trinomial. So we have x squared, then negative 4x plus 2x, that is equal to negative 2x, and then minus 8. So yes, we get the original trinomial. So we know that we have the correct answer in the factoring. Let's try another example here. Now this one has one more step that we have to follow. And the reason for that is this negative sign out front here. Whenever we factor a trinomial like this, we never want to have a negative sign attached to our first term there, which is always going to be the squared term. So remember how we had to factor out the negative sign for that question in the previous topic? Well, we're going to have to do that again here. So I'll just do a little side note here. Factor out negative 1, because remember when we factor out a negative sign, it's technically like factoring out a negative 1 before crisscross factoring. So if we were to factor out negative 1, I'm going to put negative sign out there, and I'm going to have that invisible 1 there. You don't have to write the 1. We can keep it invisible. Now there's a little bit of a shortcut we can use when we factor out a negative sign. It's going to change every single one of the signs we have in here to be the opposite. So instead of having negative z squared, we're going to have z squared inside the bracket. Then we'll have negative 12z and then plus 35. Because if you were to multiply this negative back into the brackets here, you would get negative z squared plus 12z minus 35, which would equal our original equation. So now that we've factored out that negative sign, we have a trinomial that we can work with to factor, because now this first term over here, that squared term, is positive. So let's do the same steps we did in the previous example in part A. So the first thing we did was we wrote down two factors of z squared, or the first term. So two things that would multiply to equal z squared, well, that's going to be z times z. That's our only option. Now for 35, we have a couple options again. We could do 1 times 35, or we could do 7 times 5. And we're going to stick with that one because I know that one works. Then we're going to put our crisscross and we're going to multiply along the crisscross. So starting at z, we're going to do z times 7, which gives us 7z. And then we're going to do z times 5, which gives us 5z. Now, I want to say it's very important where you put these things over here. Make sure when you follow the crisscross up, you're putting the answer up on the top. And then if you're following the crisscross down, you're putting the answer on the bottom like this. It will mess things up if you change the positioning of the 7z and the 5z here. And that goes for every single question. So now we want to look at these two here, and we want to think, is there any way we can get the middle term from those two? Is there any way we can get negative 12z from 7z and 5z? Well, yeah, we can. We can make them both negative. Negative 7z minus another 5z gives us minus 12z, which is our middle term. So we know we have the right answer here. So now we're going to take these signs that we put here and we're going to plug them in, one on the top and one on the bottom, and make sure the one that's on the top here stays on the top and the one that's on the bottom here stays on the bottom. And boom, you have your factor. So let's write this out. So I'm going to use this little therefore symbol. That's the 3 dots in a triangle shape. We're going to have negative z squared minus 12z plus 35 is equal to z minus 7 times z minus 5. And one more thing, don't forget about that negative sign we factored out right at the very beginning. So we still need to have that on the outside here. Because remember, we just factored this part of the polynomial, which gives us those two binomials there. And then we move that negative sign out front of them, and boom, we have our answer. And with these, we can always check our answer. So let's do it quickly by foiling. So let's ignore the negative sign out front here, and let's start by foiling these two binomials. So the negative sign we're just going to have chilling out front, and when we foil those two binomials, we'll have z squared, that's the first terms, then the outside would give us negative 5z, the inside gives us negative 7z, and the last terms, negative 7 times negative 5 is plus 35. And if we were to simplify that a bit, we would get z squared minus 12z plus 35. And now if we took this one step further and we distributed this negative sign into the brackets there, we would get negative z squared plus 12z minus 35. And would you look at that, we have the original expression up here. Now I do want to point out one thing before we move on. You're probably wondering, what if we did choose 1 times 35 for a crisscross? Well, let's see what would happen. So let's pretend we're factoring that z squared minus 12z plus 35. So we have z times z, because that's our only option for those two factors. But we decided to use 1 and 35, because 1 times 35 equals 35. So when we do our crisscross, we have z times 1, which would give us 1z. And then z times 35 would give us 35z. Now we need to add or subtract these to get our middle term. But is there any possible way for us to add or subtract these to get negative 12? No, there isn't. We could get plus 1 plus 35, that would give us plus 36z. If they were both negatives, it would be negative 36z. If one was negative and one was positive, we'd either have negative 34z or plus 34z. So you would get to this step here and you would be like, whoa, I can't get that middle term anywhere. So that's when you know you have to go back a step and change your factors for this one here. Now in example 3, we need to factor this trinomial. Now this one looks a little bit different. You'll notice that it is not in descending order. So you know what? We're going to put it in descending order. We're going to put the biggest exponent first. So I'm just going to reorder this, and I'm going to move that plus d squared to the front. So we're going to have d squared, and then minus 5d minus 24. So now that we reordered this trinomial in descending order, we are going to use our crisscross method to factor it. So let's first look at the two factors of d squared. Well, the only ones we have would be d times d. And then 24, we have quite a lot of options we can use. I'm going to give you the correct answer, but we could use 1 times 24, we could do 2 times 12, 3 times 8, 6 times 4. There's a lot of options, but I'm going to use the one that works so you can see how this is done. So I know that 8 times 3 is going to work for us because I've done a lot of these. So then we're going to crisscross. We're going to do d times 8, which is 8d, and d times 3, which is 3d. And if you look at these two numbers, is there any way we can get negative 5d from that? Well, there sure is. We'll put negative 8 plus 3, because that would give us negative 5d, which is our middle term. That's what we're looking for. So then we place these signs. This one goes up here, and this one goes down here. And there's our two brackets for our factoring. We have d minus 8 and d plus 3. So let's write our final answer out. D minus 8 and d plus 3. And I'm going to put a box around it. And like always, we can check our answer. And I'll skip ahead so you can see the checking. All right, so I foiled our result there and we got the original expression. Well, the one that we reordered in descending order. So we know we got that correct. So on the next page, we have a few more of these. They look a little bit different this time because now there's a coefficient on that squared term. But that's okay. These ones are actually still pretty easy. So let's do our crisscrossing here. Let's look at the factors of 2x squared and the factors of 4. So for 2x squared, there's still only one way we can split this up. We can do x times 2x, because that would give us 2x squared. And for 4, we can either do 4 times 1 or 2 times 2. I'm going to do 4 times 1. Then we're going to crisscross, so 2x times 4 is equal to 8x, and x times 1 is equal to 1x. And if we look at those two there, and we did plus 8x plus another 1x, we would get plus 9x, which is our middle term, and that's what we're looking for. So we know that a plus sign goes in the middle of the two top numbers here, and a plus sign also goes in the bottom here. Then our brackets come in like that, and we would have x plus 4 times x times 2x plus 1. So there we go. I checked my answer and I got the original polynomial. For the next one here, we have 3x squared and 20 that we're dealing with. So again, there's only one way to split up 3x squared into two things that multiply to it. We would have x times 3x. And for 20, there's a bunch of options you could do. 1 times 20, 2 times 10, but I'm going to choose 5 and 4. Then if we crisscross, we have 3x times 5, which is 15x, and x times 4, which is 4x. And if we put a plus sign by both of these, we will get our middle term, which is plus 19x. So now we're going to place these signs in here. Plus sign goes here and a plus sign goes there. And we are factored. So we get x plus 5 times 3x plus 4. And again, I just checked my answer by foiling and I got the original expression, so we're good. Try to get into the habit of checking, especially this year, so we can really make sure we're doing this correct. In C, we have 5r squared plus 13r minus 6. So again, there's only one way to split up this 5r squared. That would be r times 5r. And for this 6 here, we're going to do 3 times 2. Now 5r times 3 would give us 15r, and r times 2 would give us 2r. And how we get 13r from that is we would do plus 15 minus 2, which gives us plus 13r. So then we have a plus sign on the top here and a minus sign on the bottom here. If we were to bring those in, so if we were to factor this polynomial, we would get r plus 3 times 5r minus 2. And I just checked the answer using FOIL here, and I got the original expression, so we know we're correct. And here's the final one we're going to do. So we can do s times 3s. And to split up the 10, we're going to do 1 times 10 for this one. So we have 3s times 1, that'll give us 3s, and s times 10 gives us 10s. And if we were to put a subtraction sign in front of both of those, we would get negative 13s if we were to subtract them together. So then we know there has to be a negative sign here and a negative sign here. So if we were to factor this, we would get s minus 1 times 3s minus 10. And here is how I checked that answer using FOIL.